Sí, sí, sí. So we need to move to the next speaker. So it's my pleasure to introduce Mark Moretti. So we are changing of topic. We are changing from the climate change topic to the urban sustainability, which in fact they are more or less related in a way that we know that one of the causes of fires is not only climate change, as we have listened, it's also human action. And one of the human actions is to move from rural landscapes to cities. And as you know, the projections are that a bigger part of the population will be in cities. So urban sustainability is also a hot topic nowadays. And Marco Moretti, which is a community ecologist working at the Swiss Federal Research Institute in Zurich, is also a member of the Swiss Biodiversity Forum and of UrboBioNet, the Urban Biodiversity Research Coordination Network. So in urban ecology, Marco leads trans and interdisciplinary projects on the ecological and social values of urban nature by collaborating with ecologists, social scientists, and psychologists. In particular, he investigates direct and indirect effects of social and ecological drivers on ecosystem processes and services, and tests if and how these are mediated by changes in biodiversity and trophic interactions. So Marco, the floor is yours. Thank you.
A lot. Good morning, everyone. I hope to give you a more positive message at the end of the presentation. But of course, I mean, reality is whatever. So my talk is about socio-ecological drivers of biodiversity and ecosystem functions and service in cities. I like to start my presentation by showing how the perspective or the perception of cities has changed through times. Not only among people, but also among scientists. And this is a bit striking, because scientists are supposed to be more objective and not too much involved in emotions. But until the 70s, I would say that cities were seen as something very bad, not a place to live. Nature was outside cities, and cities eventually to work, but not really to spend free time. But suddenly, 10 years ago, 20 years ago more, so suddenly cities are become green, place to live, life of quality is a keywords among this. So also publication has raised dramatically since 2000 with several books, very good papers, not only relegated to topic journals, but also in really journals that really demonstrate that this is a universal topic. So I like I like also to see to show that to say that also the approach that ecologists, urban ecology, through time has changed. In the 70s was very much driven by ecology in the city, where humans were excluded. Only cities seen as a lab, open space lab, where actually the single items were studied, isolated, not very much in interaction. Then through times, I mean, this is still valid, is a science which is still valid and interesting to understand through experimental approach what happens. But then with the ecology of the cities, we moved to a more holistic approach, more integrative, where human needs and perception was integrated in among the rest. And the last, maybe in terms of time, was how moving science as part of a network of actors and stakeholders, including public, business, urban planners, etc. And these three, as I said, these three approaches are still valid. So this should actually help us to understand this dichotomy, this trade-off, facing increasing population, urban population living in cities, and challenging the life or quality of people and securities, but also taking the responsibility about nature conservation also in cities. It's not because the cities is mainly grey that we can say, okay, oops, we cannot protect species. Since cities are growing exponentially, and since also, as it was pointed out yesterday, most of the cities are in hotspots of biodiversity. We cannot forget this point. And this can be resolved through connection to nature, more experience with nature, environmental education, and positive attitude. So I will take this and try to build up my talk, starting with what I learned as an ecologist before moving to cities. I mean, ecology gave us a nice framework, which is the community assemblage rules. If you want to understand why some certain species are living in a certain place, actually is starting from a species regional pool. Actually, we learned that there's a series of abiotic and biotic filtering that filter out species. But usually this approach or this framework that does not include human. People like Myla Aronson reworked these assemblage rules, so actually using the same principle of species that need to reach cities by traveling across space, and cities as one of the major filters with historical legacy, abiotic conditions, fragmentation, habitat loss, but including also the human component with their needs, their expectation about plants and nature, also driven by publicity, by advertisement, Google. I mean, everything influence their choice why they put some plants and not, or maybe also education or what they learned from school. So I also like the framework by Swan, more within cities, saying something like, okay, if we have habitats which are low managed, so the socio-economical influence is low, like brownfields, or on the opposite, you have a very highly managed habitat. This will lead to different processes. Here will be more self-assembly of species, of local species and community, and this will be more facilitated by human. And the interaction of these two will give up our biodiversity and our diversity we observe often in cities. Of course, at the end of this, I mean, the species that we found in the cities will provide our processes and our ecosystem services. Okay, so based on that, I will outline now my questions. And one of the questions is how much diversity is in urban gardens? And what are the factors driving biodiversity and ecosystem function there? And are social cultural aspects involved in this? And does biodiversity play a role for gardens' well-being and restoration? And can we influence actually human attitude to change their attitude towards biodiversity? So then we'll end up with some summary and perspective. But and I will take most of my presentation will inspired by this Better Garden project, which is has been funded for the last 4 years, and which is very interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary project involving people from the councils and stakeholders, but mainly questioning what are the factors influencing gardening behavior. So is there like a policy, regulations, social norms, attitudes, perceived behavior, and how these actions afterwards, my choice, cascade into outcomes of gardens, of well-being, or below and above ground biodiversity and ecosystem processes. So actually, we use traditional methods to sample fauna and flora. So I'm an ecologist, so I'm trained on this. And we applied some ecosystem services, pest control, pollination, and wild bees fitness interactions. The same for below ground. We digged in the ground and used litter decomposition as a proxy for organic matter decomposition. And of course, people were questioned through questionnaires about their life quality and restorations. I anticipated urban gardens. Actually, we used urban gardens as model systems, both domestic gardens and allotment gardens. Since these are driven by different kind of people, you can relate to education, to incomes, to accessibility to green spaces. And we had something like 85 gardens in Zurich. We didn't have multiple cities because, I mean, a city is already complex enough if we want to deal with the local and landscape aspects. And so the first question was how much biodiversity is there, and what are the factors driving biodiversity and ecosystem functions, and are social-ecological, cultural aspects involved. So first of all, how much biodiversity? So considering plants, we found more than 1,000 species of plants, both indigenous and exotic or cultivated by people, selected by people. They put what they like. But these are there for pollinators, for herbivores. So we are not looking only at native species and excluding the rest, which is 1,000 species is a lot, I tell you. But last but not least, we found also very rare species, endangered species, and conservation concerns in Switzerland, which means that regarding conservation and responsibility, there is some margin of maneuver. And the factors that driven this biodiversity is some are easy to understand and were like according to our expectation, like the surface. The more surface you have, so with the highland theory, the more species. The number of habitats you have in a garden. So do you have flower bed, do you have vegetable bed, or only lawn, will influence also, and management intensity will negatively affect. A little bit less understand is the green age. I would have expected that with age something gets older and more complex, more integrated, more micro climates, micro habitats. And what about animals? So we also found more than 1,000 species of animals across different trophic levels and multiple taxa. And actually, just this is not to go into details, just to see which were the dominated the pollinators. Snails were doing less good. But I mean, these are a remarkable number of species which maybe nature area would have, but not intensive agricultural land. So, and this amount of arthropods biodiversity, so invertebrates species richness, actually is mainly driven by, or there is a positive correlation between plant species richness and insects or invertebrate biodiversity. And this already says something about this, because who cultivated the plants, who decided which plants is human? I mean, is the citizen are the gardeners that own the gardens. So what are the drivers actually of total invertebrate species richness. So for this, we run structural equation models, which allow to investigate direct and indirect effects. So management intensity, we have seen influence plant diversity, but also garden size and flower beds. Especially if you have flower beds, you are likely to have more species. And then we have a landscape aspect. So is it a private garden or is it allotment gardens? And how much is the habitat loss in the surrounding? And of course, what we are interested in now is the gardeners. Their attitude to biodiversity. Do they care about biodiversity in general and in their gardens? So through these questionnaires, and how high is their education? So these two factors influence negatively the management intensity. The higher you are educated, the less maybe because you don't have time, you have to teach or to busy with your work. But also your general positive attitude towards biodiversity, given by your education one side, but also your background, is influenced negatively. And management intensity, of course, influence negatively the total biodiversity, but plants diversity and through indirect effect, plant diversity influenced positively species richness. This is something that we have seen before. And it seems like home gardens are more likely to have less species. And of course, habitat loss in the surrounding is also negatively affecting something local. So what about ecosystem processes and functions? So I concentrated on two, pollination and leaf litter decomposition. So for pollination, we ran pollination experiments. Since gardens are so diverse, it was difficult to standardize the methods without using phytometers plants. So plants that actually are the same in all the gardens. And we put 6 plants per species, and we maximize the diversity, functional diversity of this, from the carrots to something more specific for long-tongue bees. The radish is also similar to carrots, easy to pollinate it, and this is the Symphytum, very much bumblebees species, because it needs also long tongues. So, and we put this in different context, as was the design in very intensively managed gardens, but also in very diverse gardens, where you barely see our experiments. And this graph shows that a general pattern for all species, the more pollination abundance, the more pollination individuals you have, the more plant reproductive success. So number of seeds per plant. This is fine. I mean, I'm released that this also works in cities. It's not like flat or nothing happens. This graph shows in the context of the landscape surrounding. So from, actually these big pictures, this strange picture comes from LiDAR images. So we could, Zurich is one of the cities which is really scanned by laser every few years. So we could really have a high resolution in the structures. So this is the gradient, urban gradient, based on laser scanning. And this is the distribution of the daily pollination capture rate. So actually, when we did these experiments, we stayed there for 9 hours during 3 days, sampling all the species and dividing by hours. So, these 2 lines shows what's happening in a garden-rich vegetation and or in a garden-poor vegetation. You see for individuals and species the contribution of having gardening more diverse can contribute to have some more bees. But this decline is along the urbanization is in general happening. And this also for hoverflies, even more dramatically. Here the contribution of a high diverse garden is not seen, and in general for all pollination you see slightly in number of individual contribution of having a more diverse gardens, but what happens here is much more strong. And of course this end up to have along these gradients decline in reproduction success, seed production by all plants. So what happened with the composition? We used litter bags to decompose litter, different litter, and we tried to understand whether along spatial scales of factors from the surrounding of the cities to the garden scale to the plot scale, whether these are influenced indirectly or whether the biotic aspect or the biotic components were mediated by these factors. And what we found is that urban warming or urban densification is directly affecting the composition positively. You would wonder why. I think it's more related to biochemistry. So the more warm, the more you speed up the biochemical processes. And also land use in terms of having different type of habitat inside of your gardens. The more you have, the more you have the composition. But then you have also direct effect of species richness and microbial activities, which were mediated by species richness positively. This is a heavy metal, which affect negatively species richness, and bacterial, of course, microbial activity. So we see that there are some components related to human, which is a land use type, number of species of plants, and also for multiple soil, multiple functionality. It seems like there are direct effect of the choice of people to have more vegetables versus more flowers, and but also this with a negative effect on multiple functionality when you have only vegetable, but also an effect, an indirect effect mediated by biomass, fauna, and diversity of soil fauna on these multiple soil functions. So the next question is, does biodiversity play a role for gardeners' well-being, and can we influence human attitudes? So I bring this graph, even though I'm not a sociologist. This was done by Chris Young during his PhD, postdoc. But I would just address or focus, like you to focus on this. So numbers, plant species affecting perceived restorativeness, which affect self-reported restorations, in amount that also other factors influence. But also gardens type. I mean, if you work in an allotment, your perceivedness of restoration is much higher than if you are at home. At home, it seems like, this is a negative for allotment, but positive for home gardens. It seems like having a garden at home, it produces you a bit of stress, because, I mean, you have the garden always there, and you look at it every day, and you say, oh, I have to do this, and I have to do that, and if someone comes, will see my garden. If you have your garden outside, you have also this feeling to be away, to be a bit on holiday, and you do also your garden. So this stress is not there when you have an allotment. It's rather negative. And of course, this stress is also influencing negatively, or actually would be positively, your the stress is influencing negatively the feeling of being restored by gardening. So, but since biodiversity is so important for your self-restorations and well-being, how are people able to estimate their biodiversity? So, of course, they buy plants, they plants, but are they able to quantify biodiversity in their own gardens? So we actually asked, to estimate how is their lawn, their meadows, if they have a meadows or a flower bed, is more like this, or their vegetable bed. And also we asked to quantify, to cross, which structure do they have? Do they have a pond? Do they have dry walls? Do they have berries? All these elements we know contribute to biodiversity. And actually, we have our estimation. So the botanist went out and knows how many plant species, how many native, how many cultivated, how many spontaneous plants there are. And we looked in which extent the estimation of people was correlated positively with what we read there. So actually by crossing this, they were able to estimate well the amount of biodiversity, but not for spontaneous plants. This is understandable. But when it comes to describe the structures, all the structures is also positively correlated with a number of species and also with spontaneous species. So by using these simple methods, now we could actually run more national-wise expertise to understand how diverse are the gardens across Switzerland or Europe. So what is the link between biodiversity needs and perception and biodiversity? Actually, this was part of an older project, Biodiversity, where we asked people to express their feeling about some pictures. And some of these pictures were modified, just adding elements that we know we are negatively affecting biodiversity, so management, structure, and many, many others. And actually the best, the one that people most selected was this one. Actually nothing comparable to what managers, city managers or park managers offer to us, more structures, rich. And these we know are more or less, this 60% of the answer fit very well, or rather well, with what biodiversity needs in terms of nesting, feeding habitats, and so on and so forth. So, but people still seems to be afraid by biodiversity. I mean, if you have ants or spiders, people, even they manage their gardens in a very beautiful way, they still have some. And then this is also driven by our social world. So how can we approach this appreciation by people of their green space and suitable habitat for biodiversity? How can we increase this overlap? Actually, maybe flagship species could help in this sense. The panda of WWF is one of these flag species, but not really something that realistic for us. So we would like to have some flagship species which has some ecological meaning. So actually we were focusing on indicator species of biodiversity. And on the other hand, charismatic species to people. And if you found something in between, this could be our flagship species. So we tried just in a small case study based on birds. So through this questionnaire, we got to know which were the indicators for charismatic species to people. Birds has to be colorful, compatible, not creating damage. Indigenous, better than exotic. Common, so I have to see it frequently. And known, I have to know in, and not something that I don't know the name. On the other hand, so we tested all our bird species, and for a positive correlation with the overall biodiversity of insects and plants, and we end up with these species. And some are colorful, some are less colorful, and you guess that our flagship species was the red woodpeckers, because it was mainly colorful and compatible. It fit actually this. So, okay, nice. But can a flagship species change our attitude? So we ran a second survey in the 3 cities of Zurich, of Switzerland, asking first about this green space, the structure, to just have an idea what they like. Again, not only national, but also cities-wise. And then we split the forms, the questionnaire in 3. 1/3 of the people got to know that the improvement of these gardens and the effort and the money will be for this species. They don't know it's a flagship species. They just have this information. Another 1/3 got this bug, and another nothing, just managing and spending money for something nice. And of course, this graph showed the acceptance. If you don't have any information, your acceptance to use money to manage is proportional to how do you like the different habitat type or the different greens. It increased a little bit if you know there is an insect or biodiversity living there, but it increased dramatically if something more appealing to your expectation, more charismatic is described. What about spending money? Nobody is happy about spending money, even not 10 euros. So this is the willingness to pay. Okay, I can pay, but I'm not happy. If you ask me to spend more than 50 euro, I'm not happy at all. This without any information. But what happens if I get some additional information about why I'm doing this? Is it for a bug? Is it for a more charismatic species? And this unhappiness start to decrease. I'm more willing to spend money on this. So, synthesis and perspectives. Urban ecosystem harbor a relatively high number of species, and this is according to many new recent papers. Of course, it needs space. It needs, so the question I addressed to Laura yesterday was land sparing, land sharing. This is a big problem. How much can we densify our cities in order to have still a good life and space for biodiversity, which is influencing indirectly our life. And human expectation and the attitude do have an effect on biodiversity and ecosystems service delivery. And this will very much depending on the perception, experience, education. And it seems there is a quite clear link between biodiversity and city dwellers' restorations. But this, I mean, has to be still to dig. I mean, we are just starting to integrating biodiversity, so elements from different disciplines into single models. Because also we speak different languages, and sometimes it's difficult. When I talk about communities, thinking animals and plants, sociologists think about community of people. So this simple, is create at the beginning a very, very huge problem. And flagship species concept seems to help or can help to interact with partners, with stakeholders, and to make biodiversity more accepted by people in general. So this is, was my last question, my last slides, and thank you for your attention.
Oh, thank you for your talk. I have a question about the peri-urban areas that are not so managed in many times, and the attitudes of people of these areas sometimes are bad, or that there are neglected areas, but many times is the place where we could find a lot of habitats or valuable habitats. Do you have seen some aspect of these areas, or?
Are you referring to brownfields or rural places, or this?
No, brownfields or brownfields, of course, but abandoned agricultural areas, or areas that is I'm referring to the rural to urban interface.
Mm-hmm. Okay. No. So I would say these are very interesting habitat type, because they host a more pioneer and type of fauna and flora. I wouldn't focus and protect this. I mean, we have to understand the urban as like a patch dynamic system, and more like a mosaic that change through times and space. So of course, if you can, but I mean, what it means managing brownfields, you have still to manage, otherwise it will turn out to be like bushes and at the end forests, or kind of forests, which still, I mean, is interesting. But usually these lands are so valuable in terms of economics, that they will, I mean, I would put more effort in the education, and more, like if some buildings will occur there, that some amount of green will be left. I mean, you have some restriction how, the distance between buildings, and often this space is like lost, is like a no man's land. We can do more to interconnect greens using these spaces. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I was thinking about two other places that that are more rare at the moment, which would be something like, for example, did you check about vertical gardens? So vertical green spaces, which are on the rise, and it's interesting because I think there's little work done on the biodiversity there. And did you check any community gardens? So gardens that are allotment gardens, but they are not managed by single persons, but by groups of people, and how does that change in terms of biodiversity?
Regarding verticals, if green roofs are part of them, yes, we did work on this. They are also quite amazing habitat. But we were more interested in to understand whether green roofs can help to make cities more permeable. So whether they interact also with the ground. So brownfield in the ground, and actually for flying insects like bees, it works. The communities are connected with other green roofs, but also with below, but not for spiders, carabids, and not flying insects. So they remains very interesting islands, but not really very functional in terms of connectivity. And the other question was community gardens. No, I mean, as in Switzerland, there is this quite traditional to have there, everyone has his lot. It will be, I mean, but the next generation of gardens will necessarily be more common community gardens, and there will be some opposition by people because they have their, I mean, they reproduce what they have at home in the gardens. They are not it's a public land, but it's not accessible to everyone because of stolen, they fear damage. So is a bit a strange situation, but of course they are very valuable in terms of biodiversity and contribution to, yeah.
Okay, sorry. Thank you, Marco, for your talk. Don't you think flagship species can be seen as a first step? I mean, they do really make biodiversity more acceptable. If you go to someone and say, okay, save the woodpecker, it's okay for everyone, but if you, this doesn't mean that people are able to appreciate, for instance, bugs. I don't know if you guided my question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, these flagship species are first of all umbrella species, so where they also occur many other species, and then you stop talking about spiders and of course, I mean, the end goal is that everyone accept also biodiversity, which is more not nice to see. But we try to avoid and to use these species to go further with the discussion. I mean, it's no point to stop and say, but not ants, but yes, bees. So I think we have the time is too short to spend time in this. If we have like a representative that can make our job, it's fine in certain circumstances where there are tensions, and so I mean it's much better to have a positive flag than fighting just for you know, this yes, this no, yeah. But of course, I mean, it would be nice.
Thank you very much. There is a question there.
Hi.
Yep.
Thank you for your talk. It's very interesting. And do you think we can influence really with politics the use or the development of more biodiversity in the garden? I mean, from politics, can we try to influence this strongly?
Yeah, I'm a bit biased. I mean, we have a very nice direct democracy in Switzerland, so we vote every month for, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 items. Since people seem to have quite clear idea what they want in terms of parks and management, their voice could influence quite a bit politicians. And yes, I think depending on the context, maybe political context, you can influence. Yep.
Is there? Okay.
Thank you for your interesting talk. Two questions. Did you compare your results to the Asian mega city cities, and how does it compare? And the other side of the coin of this urbanization is more abandoned land.
The what? Sorry.
The other side of the fact that people are going to live more and more in cities is also more abandoned land.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you relate this in this urban ecology concept?
No, I mean, I would dream to go in some mega cities and do this work. I'm trying to do it via collaborations, but not so far. I mean, up to now we are at the European level. But not sure to understand the second question. So you mean by people moving in the cities, there will be more abandoned land outside? Okay. I see from the agricultural viewpoint, I see more intensification. Maybe in the forests, there is an increasing amount of forest, and not only in surface, but in biomass. This is true. I mean, it's a socio-economic change that but it's not only recent. It's since the 19th centuries when people start to migrate, they abandon their land. Yes, I mean, it's difficult to deal with. I mean, this is really space for interdisciplinary project in terms of someone look outside, someone look inside cities. but I mean, I'm a bit reluctant to compare cities with outside cities. This was the approach in the 60s when they compared Swiss cities with pristine habitats, and always showing that cities are bad. But yeah, but I see that your question goes a bit in another direction, more in abandonment and what we do with that. Yeah, okay, I cannot answer.
I was wondering if in your work you are also considering the broader scale impacts. So in terms of homogenization, you can achieve very high local biodiversity, which is often true for many urban areas. But then the issue is that cities tend to then have the same set of species all over, and this goes under this concept of homogenization. And is there a way you think it is possible to address this? So maybe working on different people perception and so diversifying the biodiversity from city to city?
I mean, when I realized that this homogenization issue was also related to an epistemological aspect, I mean, studying homogenization starting from the rural pristine to the cities is not fair. I mean, I would like to do it with comparing meadows and forests. I'm sure going from an ecosystem to the other, you will lose some species. You will have winners and losers. I think much more, and I see also the tendency, the trend among urban ecologists to work within cities. So, and to have this ecology, 2 cities and 4 cities, and to minimize or mitigate this homogenization, which, I mean, is a characteristic of this ecosystem, is to maximize the diversity. And, but also I think is a matter of methodology. I mean, people tend to study one habitat per time, so green roofs, then you go for green roofs. Parks, you go for parks. But what about the mosaics, the effect of mosaics? Not in terms of just an index of the heterogeneity, but also what type of habitat, are there a combination of habitats that are dealing with where more biodiversity will emerge? Animals often move, and they move also through ontogeny, so they need as larvae some type of habitat, as adult some other type. If they have to move too long distance from larvae to adults, this is not positive. If you have your adult habitat close by, then it's fine. So also the configuration where these habitats are is important. I think we need both. Diversity, but also maybe also methodological, more appropriate approach to understand this.
We have one more question here, and then the last one, I think.
Thank you very much for this exciting and stimulating presentation. There was a presentation yesterday by a medical doctor who showed that it has been proved, documented already, a direct interaction between the time people spend in green areas, even if they live in cities, and health problems in, say, heart condition, different types of heart diseases, blood pressure, depressions, behavioral problems, and so on. I think this is a very important fact. Amount of knowledge that we've gathered already, although this line of research is still at the beginning, but that you can use to influence politicians. A lot of studies have also been done at university campus, and it's the same. The conclusions are similar. Students will have a better performance and better marks at the end, and so on.
To me, it's also a matter of being educated. I mean, 80% of the people live now in cities. If we can make them experience a true nature and not or understanding processes, a garden is really a nice open air lab where you see interaction working, not just in books, and end up with fruits, with vegetables. If you have a pond, you observe fantastic stuff. And then this translated also in your perception and your decision when you go to vote or to understand more complex aspects. Everything is not abstract anymore. You have experienced this, and I think this is also a positive effect.
Okay. Many thanks for presentation. It was very inspiring, and
thank you.
I was wondering when you explain all these kind of gardens in Zurich, if there is any similar study in more Mediterranean areas, places where water is really a scarce resource, because I was wondering and why this kind of activities cannot be done when you have very little water, for instance. No? Mm-hmm. And so in those cases, even if people probably would like to do that, there is a limitation from the ecological point of view, climate in this case, mm-hmm. but also a cultural thing. I think the difference between the cultures are probably widespread. Mm-hmm. So you said that in Switzerland, everyone wants to have his own piece of land. Mm. For instance, where I live, the common lands are the most of the surface of the region are common lands, and there are small villages that have a common land. And okay. in some places, if you are the last inhabitant of that land, of that village, all the common land is yours. Okay. But yeah. This is happening now with the decrease of demography.
So, related to research in more Mediterranean area, I mean, you are here in the best place. I mean, Lisbon has long tradition in urban ecology, and see some colleagues here that studies Almada or Lisbon, and in the same way I'm studying. Maybe they have more expertise in other organisms, but and we are sharing currently a biodiversity project comparing different cities across Europe. And water, I mean, yesterday we had a nice talk about water, more marines. But of course, in inland, you don't have marines, you don't have coast, but you have rivers. And often these cities have developed along rivers and along lakes, which are, again, very high hotspot of biodiversity. And I would say that most of the Mediterranean cities have also built on rivers, because in the past were like the main trade way to transport stuff, and so there is water, but maybe not in a mass as one expects. But also the fauna would be adapted to this. I mean, maybe I would this is a guess that in Central Europe, the filter from a species to come to cities is based mainly on resistant to droughtness, so tolerance to droughtness. Maybe in a context where it's already dried outside in the species pool in the regions, this is a lesser problem. I mean, maybe you might have much more species living outside, also doing good well in cities, because they are a bit more dried, but it's also dry outside. But this is just a guess.
Okay, so sorry, we need to finish, so let's thank again to Marco.